Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you joining us today. So Melinda and I are going to kind of volley back and forth as we go through the slides, but we're really excited to bring to you wages, benefits, and pension, the recommendations specifically from the workforce policy table. So we would like to start today off with a land acknowledgement. So I am joining today from the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinantah nations along the shores of Deshkon-Zipi, which is the Antler River. This area is colonially known as London, Ontario. And Melinda, over to you.
Thank you, Sadia, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Bree, for sharing. As Sadia shared, my name is Melinda. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a registered early childhood educator and also a mother of two and a white settler woman. Today, I'm joining from Tkaronto, also known as Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit and the Anishinaabeg and the Chippewa and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. Tkaronto is also home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For today's webinar, I wanted to be slightly intentional about our work here and discussing workforce policies, which require relationship building, care, respect, and justice across our sector, and that we really need to work in partnership with Indigenous children, families, and educators, and really work to build a system with each other that is truly inclusive of Indigenous knowledge systems, knowledge keepers, and ways of being. And so with that, I'll bounce back to Bree.
Thanks, Melinda. So we just wanted to know that it's important that Childcare Now's office is located on the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, but the organization is active on the lands ceded, unceded, and contested across Turtle Island. As a national advocacy organization, Childcare Now respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands and waters with whom we strive to work with in solidarity. Childcare Now commits to the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and the advance of the process of Canadian reconciliation. We note in particular call number 12, which calls upon all government to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families. We hope to kind of touch on that a little bit today as we speak to some of the recommendations. So just very quickly, agenda, just a very brief overview of what we're hoping to cover. So the project overview, we will start just to give a little bit of background on Educators Matter and the work that we do, the current context, the actual recommendations themselves. We will then go into a breakout room discussion, and then we will quickly connect back about the discussion and then wrap up. So we just wanted to note again, we want to hear from you. Please feel free to ask questions, share comments through the chat. We would just ask that you don't unmute, just because Melinda and I can get a little sidetracked when we're chatting. And we want to make sure we get to the meat of the presentation and cover that fully. However, we will do our best to try and address questions as they come through the chat. And if we miss them or don't get to them, we will speak to them before we head into the breakout room discussion. Okay, so quickly, project overview. So what is the Childcare Now Educators Matter project? We are a 3-year project starting in 2023 with the conclusion being next year in 2026. And we are committed to advancing collective knowledge on Canada's early learning and childcare workforce. So we are workforce specific. Childcare Now, though, spans many, many different projects and topics. This particular project is just focused on the workforce. We work to develop policy solutions that address the retention and recruitment crisis and support the implementation of the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Plan. You may know it as CWELC or QUELC, or the $10 a day childcare program. We do this through background research about the workforce and current policies that are in place across the country. And also by engaging with the sector to understand more comprehensively the why behind sectoral asks for better wages, supports, and working environments for the workforce. We also support other groups in Canada who are working on similar projects or have a similar vision and values about the early learning and childcare workforce. Our work is guided by frequent meetings with the National Early Learning and Childcare Workforce Policy Table, as well as a smaller advisory committee that is made up of members of that policy table. So the policy table itself is comprised of representatives from within the early learning and childcare workforce across Canada and meets to discuss pertinent policy issues, develop recommendations, and share experiences within their own working and advocacy contexts. So if you are interested in who currently sits on the policy table, all of that can be found on our website. We will ensure that any links that we are mentioning are shared with you throughout the presentation. The wages, benefits, and pensions portion was the first set of recommendations developed from this project. So we're very excited to share that further with you. But our work is definitely extending beyond that now. We might be able to touch on that a little bit as we get into wrap up from today. So these are kind of the key publications that we want to focus on. So the two publications released so far are on the left, a summary of early learning and childcare workforce policies as of December 2023 under the Canada-wide childcare system. So this is just like a very brief overview of what the current policies are that exist. It's a really good precursor to looking at any of the specific recommendations that are being offered. The second one on the right is the wages, benefits, and pensions policy recommendations developed by the National Early Learning and Childcare Workforce Policy Table. This is what we will be speaking to with you today. Both of these publications, again, can be accessed on the website. We will also be sharing these slides with you in a PDF format following in the follow-up email. So these images can be clicked on and to open the documents as well. Okay, Melinda, over to you.
Thanks, Bree. So we're just in terms of getting a real lay of the land and what's the current context with respect to wages. Certainly there are many differences and unique approaches to the rollout of the 10-a-day plan, but there are also lots of commonalities. So I think it's really important as we get started and to really review some of those documents Bree spoke to just a moment ago, to get a sense of where we're all at across the country, and really learn from each other and find out what other provinces and territories are doing in order to support what can be some really positive local and regional advocacy work and also policy development. So certainly one of the major changes since 10-a-day is the implementation of wage grids for many provinces. So we've got Quebec, PEI, Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia with something a little more comprehensive, Manitoba, unfortunately not mandatory, New Brunswick, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories all have implemented some kind of wage grid. And when we say wage grid, we essentially, it's certainly quite complex, but we essentially mean any sort of grid or rate that also accounts for employment roles, experience, or employment, roles, experiences, and potential qualifications. Some wage grids that are in progress still are BC and Saskatchewan and Yukon as well in development. I'm sure you know, and we know this here as well in Ontario, that there are no wage grids for Alberta and Ontario, and they currently operate as sort of wage top-ups or wage enhancements. In Ontario, we have a wage floor and are certainly not sufficient. Some recent updates, literally just in the last couple of weeks, Nunavut has recently increased their wage grid by 7.5%. And just last week, Northwest Territories announced an increase to their dedicated wage funding, which will look like about an average of $9 an hour more for ECEs. So I thought I'd share that because that is a fairly new development. And the current context with pensions and benefits. So we certainly know this is absolutely critical for the workforce and critical to support improved working conditions. There's some really great examples with Nova Scotia and their defined benefit pension plan. And we will also have a little brief forthcoming on that defined benefit plan around Nova Scotia and some more information about that. Prince Edward Island has a defined contribution pension plan, and Newfoundland and Labrador have an extended health plan. And Yukon, and there's some other good examples with Yukon, Manitoba, and certainly Quebec, where they have some type of pension and benefit plan package, but not necessarily defined like the others. So I'll move on to what's working. So certainly wage grids implemented widely since 10 a day for the first time. So really this is bringing a wider transparency and a degree of stability to the sector. So that's really great to see. There's been some real gains in pensions and benefits coverage in some provinces, but as you can see, not a great deal of movement across the board. Significant increases as well in funding. This is a big piece for post-secondary education and professional development. Lots of provinces are really intending to make ECE training more widely available, more access to continuous professional learning, which ideally really aligns with those higher pay wage grids. But more access to post-secondary and ongoing learning really needs to happen. So with this last point I'll mention, it's really important point about wages, that they're no longer on the backs of families and on parent fees. So this new public funding means educator wage increases are possible without increasing parent fees. And so I think really what this points to is opening up of possibilities to see what can happen with appropriate, robust public funding. And certainly what still needs more work. The list is long, but many wage grids really do still fail to compensate educators properly for their education, as well as their experience and their skills. And the wage rates are really still too low, especially relative to other sectors, including education. There's really no requirement currently for co-development and collaboration with the workforce on compensation frameworks. And so there's really no formal mechanisms that allow the workforce to weigh in and co-develop. And this is very unique to the ELCC sector. It really does miss educator voices. There's no sectoral bargaining. Whereas in other professions from other sectors, there are those voices of the professions. Nurses and teachers are often cited. And there's also a lack of formal regular review processes and evaluation. So we don't really know what's happening and how they're reviewing the current grids. And most jurisdictions also still without real sectoral-wide pensions, as I mentioned, and benefit plans, and that there's no real commitment to implement one. So there's lots of work still to be done, and that's part of where we are at with our recommendations.
Yeah, so as Melinda kind of alluded to there, a lot of what still needs work are built into the recommendations that are made in this report. So, and I just want to be very specific that this is a summary of the recommendations that were published. We do recommend that if you are interested, if this is something of value to you, that you do read the full recommendations. This is really just going to be a high-level overview of some of the key pieces. So in terms of wages, this is the official stance that the National Policy Table has taken. So first is fair and equitable principles for setting wages. They should be competitive with other sectors and demonstrate a clear value of the early learning and childcare workforce for their education, qualifications, and skills. Next is that public funding parameters and integration of wages needs to be a part of the funding formulas. So there needs to be enough funding to support wages, and this shouldn't be viewed as an add-on, something that we can tack into existing formulas. It should be built right in. Integrated funding in center budgets is essential to supporting quality childcare. Next is a formalized process for sector involvement in determining wages. So as Melinda alluded to, in a lot of other publicly funded sectors, there is an opportunity for employees to participate in the setting of wages or the creation of wage grids. So nurses and teachers, for example, often do this by participating in union bargaining processes. This would be something that's very new for this sector. Most of our sector is not unionized with the exemption of portions of the Quebec workforce. And if workers are a part of an association, it's usually voluntary and they don't necessarily have any sort of a bargaining power. This is a process that would need to be established, but the recommendations don't go specifically into detail about how to do this. We feel that it's really important that this process is developed in consultation with the workforce to determine what would be the best course of action with a real focused, localized perspective, because it likely is going to need to have some variation based on needs. Okay, next would be integrating wage grids with policies regarding scope of practice, qualification recognition, and equitable access to education. So the wage grids need to recognize these important distinctions within the workforce and honor the different qualifications and knowledges that we value as a sector that we see as contributing to quality. This would include first and foremost Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but would also include many other alternative pathways, micro-credentialing, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different things that could be included in this scope. Next is strong evaluation and accountability mechanisms, both at the provincial and territorial level and at the federal level. Yes. And then finally, the last one is robust federal funding allocations and guidelines that facilitate the recruitment and retention of the early learning and childcare workforce in the provinces and territories. So far, we've seen a really great infusion of federal funding to the provinces and territories, a lot of which has gone to reducing parent and family fees, which is so important, we know, for equitable access to childcare. However, our position is that there should be more federal funding that is targeted specifically to supporting the workforce. So I'm going to pass it back to Melinda to elaborate a little bit further on some of these key recommendations because there is a bit of background context that really informs these.
Thanks, Bree. So some of the key points behind the recommendations for fair and equitable principles for setting wages. And before I go into that, I just want to note that there are a number of others, which I know Bree has mentioned as well, that do explain more in length within the policy document itself. So certainly one of the first starting points is those employed in licensed childcare and funded through 10 a day should, of course, be covered by provincially set wage grids. And that those are really established competitively with entry-level wages and outlines really how the rate can increase and are really based and informed by years of experience, qualifications, and job responsibilities. And that wage grids should also be competitive and determined through fair and appropriate wage comparisons. And that folks really need to be paid a decent wage relative to the cost of living, which of course is based on jurisdiction. And lastly, that as Bree mentioned as well, mechanisms need to be established for those who work in the sector to really negotiate and co-develop those compensation systems, again, as an example of collective bargaining. So moving on to the federal role, certainly the federal role is to transfer funds to provinces, territories, and Indigenous governments, and that the need really is for dedicated and long-term funding to support standards of working conditions, including fair wage grids. So certainly many of you may know that before the election call, 11 provinces and territories renewed their CWEL agreements with the federal government and is continuing now that funding into 2031. And that finally, the last point is that we really need to advocate to provincial and territorial governments to put that funding in to match those federal contributions. Especially for those that aren't necessarily covered under the Canada-wide programs, like school educators as well.
Okay, so similar to the wages piece, this is again just a high-level overview of some of the key recommendations regarding benefits and pensions. So structuring pension and benefit plans to ensure full and equitable coverage. So we want to really reiterate, same with the wages piece, this needs to cover the whole workforce. So that includes leadership, that includes home child care providers, cooks and dietary planners, anyone who is making a significant contribution to the care of children in center spaces should be covered in this. So currently, most early learning and childcare workers don't have access to any benefits or pensions. Second, an increased federal role in the setting of national standards and guidelines. So this really is just to ensure that no matter where you are located within the country, that you have access to benefits and pension. Third, all employees working in licensed childcare should be covered by a province or territory-wide defined benefit pension plan. Employer pension contributions should be funded by the provincial and territorial governments. There should be supplementary retirement allowances paid to employees who retire within 5 or less years of the pensionable service. A good example of this is the years of service grant in Prince Edward Island. All employees working for licensed childcare should have access to a comprehensive health and dental benefits plan with contributions based on expert recommendations. If insured coverage for part-time or casual employees is possible to obtain, alternatives such as payments in lieu of benefits should also be pursued. And then finally, at the last kind of key point here is that benefits should be competitive with other public sectors. So similar to the wages piece, we want to ensure that all forms of compensation match similar work that's being done in other sectors. Okay, back over to you, Melinda. Melinda, you're muted.
Sorry, I didn't get too far, thanks. So some of the key themes that guided the thinking in these recommendations and the development process, I want to highlight. And I'll also note that Bree and I are new to this team. And so a lot of this work you might have heard of earlier in the fall was led by 2 team members, Rachel and Ta, who are both currently on parental leave. So Bree and I are coming into this work and I feel super passionate and guided by some of the thinking that came out through these recommendations. And one of them first, of course, is that system building takes time, a great deal of time. And in order to do that, and we need to get the design right, and getting the design right and really accounting for all of these complexities requires time. And that the details around workforce policy development are really complex, but really interconnected. So something that we're working on right now are some of those other additional complexities and factors. So understanding the relationship between wages, benefits, pensions, but also with qualifications, with other working conditions that impact the workforce, and how all of that work really is lived in real life by educators is really important. And that every province and territory is certainly at a different place in their system building, in their 10-a-day system building. And that these national recommendations can certainly help inform the local, provincial, and territorial advocacy. Certainly, though, recommendations cannot do the job on its own, and they really do need to be brought to life through this jurisdictional advocacy and really make meaning out of them within communities. So the advocacy piece is certainly a key part, as is the research and the policy development for childcare now. But the advocacy piece is a really critical part of the organization's mission. And it really does need to happen at that local level, as well as that federal level. Okay. Yes. Okay, I see a question has come through. Certainly, funding is, so I'm just responding to a question here in the chat, and feel free to jump in too, Bree, if you want to jump in, but worry about, where this money is coming from, certainly. And I think one of the key pieces that is communicated throughout this recommendations document and throughout all the other resources on the website is that it's really shared funding, that there's funding at that federal level, there's funding at that provincial level. But if we're investing in quality early learning for children and families, we need to invest in the workforce. We know that early learning cannot happen without the workforce. And so it's one piece to lower fees, which is certainly where the funding has been focused for the last little while, but we now need to turn our attention to adequately supporting the workforce. I don't know if you'd have any more thoughts to add to that, Bree.
No, yeah, I think, yeah, that would be accurate. And I mean, you're right, it would inevitably end up being tax money, but I think there needs to be a really serious consideration of how those are being distributed. Social sectors have unfortunately been pretty consistently underfunded, and I'm sure that if we took a look at budgets and reprioritized, there would be ways to better use taxpayer money.
Yeah, but absolutely, it certainly would come from that. I mean, that's what building a system requires, certainly a social system. And it's not something we've done in the early learning sector ever. So if we look at healthcare, if we look at other social systems and social sectors, and what we need to be safe and grow and happy and have well cared for children, then it's going to require money.
Any other questions before we move to just a couple of like wrap up communication pieces? So just another question came in, Melinda. When taxes already make up 42% of income, has childcare now considered how viable this is?
Yeah, I think certainly the cost of living and taxes is extremely challenging. And so we're looking at all of those pieces. And when it comes down, I think, to the numbers and the specifics around the implementation, that has to be sort of looked at that jurisdictional level. And so these are essentially broad guidelines. Getting into the specifics is something that I think happens at that local, provincial level.
I don't think the proposal is to increase taxation. I think it's just a reevaluating of how taxation occurs and how that's broken up. And again, as Melinda said, really at that jurisdictional local level, because it is going to have to be specific to the needs of the community that it's being implemented in.
Certainly. Yeah. No, it's tough stuff. Okay.
It is tough. Yeah, we are in a pretty serious cost of living crisis, so I 100% understand the hesitancy around asking for more dollars for things. It seems very impossible right now. So, okay, any other questions or concerns, comments? Okay, so if the goal is that wages for ECEs are intending to be equitable across Canada, will there also be childcare recommendations to make QUALC equitable too, rather than equal?
Hmm. Or, yeah, I think we need to sort of take a pause on that one and give it a little bit more thought. Maybe, I'm not sure, maybe Corey, if you could clarify, or maybe I'm misinterpreting. We can certainly, as well, we can certainly follow up with folks via email. If you want to have a broader conversation as well about the CWELC and 10 a day.
Just a comment, as always, the cost of increased taxes need to be compared to the cost of doing nothing. And then an additional.
And this might be a really good opportunity to continue this conversation also within a small breakout groups. But before we do that, I think we wanted to share some information around project communications. If we can move into
Yeah. So Sadia just had to step out, so I will cover this section just
sure.
briefly. But if I miss anything, I'm hopeful that Sadia will be able to join back in, and if I've missed something, she can cover it. So just some project specific communication. So if you're wanting to know a little bit more about the Educators Matter project specifically, we do frequent project publications and updates on the Educators Matter page. So they're available in both French and English. And we do also, like Childcare Now as an organization, has a newsletter that if you are not currently signed up for, we would definitely encourage you to do so. It's just a very good summary of some of the highlights of the work that we've been doing as an organization. Alberta specific, because we know the folks on the call are sign up. And given the mention about the subsidy program, there was also a very, very thoughtful letter put together around the changes to the subsidy program. So if you are interested in reading that and signing on, that QR code is provided for you here. And then finally, again, for Alberta, the Alberta chapter specifically, there is a Facebook page, an Instagram page, and an X page, all of which provide relatively frequent updates. And then for more information, we encourage you to go right to the Alberta Childcare Now website. And there is also a specific email to reach out to this chapter.
Thank you so much to all who joined. And if you'll also be able to send all those links to those who, attended, but then maybe had to bow out, or if you need to share with others. And we're happy to continue this conversation via email if you have any other questions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you. Bye. Jen, are you